that in order to fund school vouchers, funds are being diverted from public schools. Does the school voucher policy weaken the public school system in the U.S.?
I'd first like to respond by saying that the resolution says school voucher programs. If we look towards the 8 school voucher programs that have been implemented in America, none of them have diverted funds from the public schools, according to the Brookings Institute and according to another study by the Cato Institute. So what we're seeing is not only are they not diverting funds, but for these minority children, they're getting higher results. My opponents want you to believe that the pure pupil costs and the test scores are the same, but this is simply not true. The one study they bring up did not account for demographic factors, such as average income or minority demographics. When we do account for those factors, like in the study I brought up from Washington, D.C., we saw a 48% improvement in their test scores for African Americans and for Hispanic minorities. At the point where that's happening and where we're allowing kids the opportunities they would not have in any other way, because like my opponents say, they have no other choice but to go to the public school, it obviously is not going to weaken the public system, and in fact, it improves the public school system, because if they do not increase their standards, they will simply not have any pupils. So we're going to cause the weakest schools to improve, and if they're too weak to improve, then they're going to disappear, which is only beneficial for the American educational system as a whole.
Thank you. Do the Dems want to have a rebuttal to that?
Yes, we do. First of all, I'd like to clear up a little misunderstanding. Ivana tells you that these programs do not revert funds from public schools, but that's actually absolutely not the case. We have evidence from the Huffington Post, the Badger Herald, which is the local newspaper in Milwaukee that has covered a lot of the voucher programs in Milwaukee, the largest program in the United States. Evidence from Fox News and from State Impact NPR, which all show that this substantially takes money away from public schools. For those of you that are not familiar with vouchers, the way that vouchers work is that they take the money that would go towards that student's education in a public school and put it into the private school through the voucher system. This takes money that would go to public schools and puts it in private schools. That's the way that they work. The second problem is that the only statistic that the Republicans have given you that vouchers are working is that some 4% of African American students in DC are increasing math skills. Now, the first problem with that is if you think of that evidence alone, if vouchers were really working, wouldn't they be able to provide you evidence for not just African American students in math in DC? Wouldn't they be able to provide you evidence for other places in the United States, for other demographics, and for other things besides reading? Because multiple studies covered by the Center for American Education have shown that the vast majority of voucher programs lead to comparable, if not worse, scores for all demographics across the United States in more subjects than just math. This shows that the voucher system is not working and that there's actually no improvement.
Thanks. Do the Republicans have a quick response to that?
Yeah, I just don't understand. My opponents haven't yet responded to our central argument, which is that by increasing competition, we're giving these people a choice for the first time, but more importantly, our statistic not only looked at African Americans, looked at minorities, but I think my partner wanted to add something briefly.
Also, we're not arguing to decrease funding for public schools. The resolution is to increase funding for vouchers, not to decrease the funding for other public schools, so that's...
I think there's an inherent misdefinition between an educational tax credit, where the tax that you would pay for a public school is diverted to a private voucher, and a voucher program. They try to assume with one small example of a very small voucher program, but we've never had a federal increase in voucher spending like the resolution proposes, so you need to remember that in today's debate.
All right, thank you. The next question is for the Dems, and sorry, we're trying to push this forward, so we won't have too much back and forth for this portion of it. But the question for the Dems is, even though a fully implemented school voucher policy might not have enough spots to go around to everyone, isn't it worth it, regardless of pure ideology, to give a few students at least the chance to get out of a failing public school system?
I'll take care of this one. Let's first respond to the increased competition argument that the opponent argues. The increased competition that results from having all of this, more schools, private schools, this is not government, is a false assumption. What you have created here is an economies of scale problem, where the bigger schools have a competitive advantage over smaller private schools. There is no need to say that competition, in a perfectly competitive market, this would be the case, that everybody has a higher quality of education across the board. But this is not the case because the students that attend schools that cost $40,000 a year $50,000 a year already have a huge advantage since all of these schools are from well-established funds, well-established grants, and have a huge advantage over students that attend schools that go for $6,000 a year or $7,000 a year. Now going back to the original question, which was...
whether it's worth it to give a few students by making school vouchers a chance to.
It is not worth it because it's just not fair. It's that simple. Why would we take just 4,000 students or 3,000 students or 2,000 students a chance to get an educational opportunity somewhere else when we can lift up all of the students in that school, an inner city school, say in Harlem, or say in, say Camden, New Jersey. We can lift up all of these students rather than just a select few. By taking away the funds, which it is what's happening here, right? We are taking away funds that would have gone to the public educational system into a private school. We are taking away the opportunity for everybody else in the inner city to get that educational opportunity.
Also, to add on what David said, the central assumption is that students actually receive a better education in a private school. That's simply not the case. In fact, David read you evidence earlier that shows that at some private schools, some 0.8% of students are at proficient levels of math, some 5.7% are proficient levels of reading. This is inexcusable. That we're talking about this as if private schools are necessarily better because they're private is absolutely not supported by the facts.
So I've heard, yeah, you can start, Rich, sorry.
So, going on what you just said, you're right that a private school isn't necessarily better. And what we're giving them with increased voucher funding is a choice. So if the public school is a better school, they have the choice to go there.
Yeah, so let's look towards the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and let's look towards the fact that my opponents neglect to tell you that in low-income areas, the public schools are absolutely atrocious. They're spending approximately 40 cents per pupil as compared to private schools in the area, sending $12.50 per pupil. Now, more importantly, as my opponent tries to tell you this is an economy of scale. The problem is it's not an efficient economy of scale. We're spending more per pupil, but we're getting worse results on average in low-income areas. More importantly, remember that every year, in New York alone, for example, we waste $65 million with teachers who cannot be fired because they literally sit in a room and don't do anything because they're in teacher unions. There's a lot of wasted funds happening in public schools that are keeping the resources trapped from the kids that need it. But it's a bit hypocritical to say that this is a bad idea for poor low-income kids when we go to a school like Columbia. If we're happy with our product, we will simply transfer to another school because we are paying for it. If people have choice, if people have the power, they will get the results they want because you add consumer choice. So the underlying premise, even if you decide to ignore statistics completely, still stands that these kids have absolutely no choice and that it is a better option for the majority of them.
Do you have a quick response to that, Dems?
Yeah, I think the main thing that Ivana's confused about right now by comparing Columbia to public schools is that public schools are a public service. Unlike schools like of Columbia and schools of higher education where people can pay or get scholarships to learn even more, public schools are provided by the federal government because based on the fundamental belief that when students benefit, when citizens can learn, our society as a whole is better. Didn't Ivana say that in her opening speech when she mentioned that by every dollar we invest in elementary and secondary education, we get a $7 return early on? That's the basis of public education. That's what that's about. And because it's a public service, it doesn't compete in the same way businesses do. To talk about public schools competing is just illogical. They're not in it for the profit. They can't have the resources to raise money or spend money differently, to compete for pupils like a business competes for customers. That's not how that works. That's how private schools may work when they're profit-driven and don't want to educate their kids. But that's not what public schools do. Public schools are a public service that are not in it for the profit, that are in it to